In the summer of 1314, on the rolling fields near Stirling, a clash was about to unfold that would defy every rule of medieval warfare. Picture this: fewer than 7,000 Scottish warriors, many barefoot and armed with simple spears, standing firm against the mightiest army England had ever assembled. An English host so vast that chroniclers claimed it stretched beyond the horizon, numbering perhaps 30,000 men from across Europe. Knights from France, Germany, and Flanders rode alongside English nobles, their armor gleaming in the morning sunday. Welsh archers carried longbows that had broken armies across the continent. This was not merely a battle between two kingdoms. This was David facing Goliath on a scale that would echo through the centuries. The odds were so overwhelming that any reasonable commander would have retreated into the hills, choosing guerrilla warfare over open battle. Yet Robert the Bruce, King of Scots, made a choice that seemed like madness. He would stand and fight. What followed over 2 brutal days would shatter the foundations of medieval military thinking and birth, a legend that still stirs hearts 700 years later. This is the story of Bannockburn, where the impossible became reality, and a nation's freedom hung on the courage of men who refused to yield. To understand the miracle that was about to unfold, we must first journey back to the events that brought these two armies face to face on the banks of the Bannockburn. Scotland in 1314 was a kingdom reborn from ashes, forged by years of brutal warfare and shaped by the iron will of one man. Robert the Bruce had spent 8 years transforming himself from a fugitive king into the most feared military commander in Britain. His path to this moment had been carved through blood, betrayal, and desperate struggles that would have broken lesser men. The crisis began decades earlier with the death of Scotland's king, leaving the realm without a clear successor. Into this vacuum stepped Edward I of England, a monarch whose appetite for conquest had earned him the title Hammer of the Scots. Edward saw opportunity in Scotland's weakness, installing a puppet king and treating the proud northern kingdom as little more than a rebellious province. The resentment this bred would fuel decades of warfare, beginning with William Wallace's stunning victory at Stirling Bridge in 1297. But Wallace's triumph was short-lived. The English war machine crushed him at Falkirk, and by 1305, the great patriot met his end on the executioner's block in London. It seemed Scotland's dream of independence had died with him, yet from the darkest hour emerged an unlikely champion. Robert the Bruce, grandson of one of the original claimants to the Scottish throne, made a decision that would change everything. In 1306, after killing his rival John Comyn in a church quarrel, Bruce seized the crown of Scotland for himself. What followed was a campaign of guerrilla warfare, unlike anything medieval Europe had seen. Bruce understood that Scotland could never match England's resources in conventional battle. Instead, he waged a war of shadows, striking from the forests and hills, burning castles rather than holding them, and slowly bleeding the English occupation dry. Village by village, castle by castle, Bruce reclaimed his kingdom through cunning, courage, and an unbreakable will to see his people free. By 1314, Bruce's strategy had succeeded beyond all expectations. Of the great English fortresses that once dotted Scotland, only 2 remained: Berwick on the border and the mighty Stirling Castle, guardian of the crossing of the River Forth. It was Stirling that would prove the catalyst for the confrontation that was coming. In early 1313, Bruce's brother Edward laid siege to the castle, but rather than starving out the garrison, he made an agreement that would force the hand of history. The castle's commander, Sir Philip Mowbray, proposed a deal. If no English relief force arrived by Midsummer's Day 1314, he would surrender Stirling to the Scots. This chivalrous agreement, common in medieval warfare, created a trap that Edward II of England could not avoid. To lose Stirling without a fight would mean abandoning his father's dream of conquering Scotland and accepting Bruce as the legitimate king. The young English monarch, with the legacy already struggling of his formidable father, had no choice but to respond with overwhelming force. Throughout the winter and spring of 1314, summons went out across England and beyond. The greatest army ever assembled for a Scottish campaign began to gather. The English host that marched north in June 1314 was a testament to medieval military power. Contemporary chroniclers speak of numbers that strain belief, with some claiming the army exceeded 100,000 men. Modern historians suggest more conservative figures, but even by careful estimates, Edward commanded between 20 and 30,000 warriors. This was not merely an English army, but a coalition of Europe's finest fighting men. Knights from Gascony, Brittany, and the German states rode alongside English nobles. Welsh longbowmen, whose deadly accuracy had won battles across France, marched in disciplined ranks. Flemish crossbowmen brought their mechanical precision to the English cause. The cavalry alone numbered over 3,000 heavy horse, each knight a master of mounted warfare, trained from childhood in the arts of war. These were men clad in the finest mail and plate, riding destriers bred for battle, carrying lances that could punch through armor like paper. Behind them came the infantry, spearmen from the English shires, crossbowmen from the continent, and siege engineers with their terrible machines. Supply trains stretched for miles, carrying food, weapons, and the wealth needed to sustain such a massive force in enemy territory. Against this avalanche of steel and flesh, Robert the Bruce could muster perhaps 7,000 men. His army was a reflection of Scotland's long struggle, hardened veterans of guerrilla campaigns, farmers and craftsmen who had taken up arms for their freedom, Highland clansmen with their ancient weapons, and a small force of light cavalry under Sir Robert Keith. Many of Bruce's soldiers fought barefoot, their equipment salvaged from fallen enemies or forged in village smithies. Where the English knights rode in gleaming armor, the Scots wore leather and mail. Where English banners displayed the wealth of great houses, Scottish standards bore the simple symbols of a people fighting for their homes. Yet what Bruce's army lacked in numbers and equipment, it possessed in something far more valuable: absolute unity of purpose. These were not mercenaries fighting for pay or feudal levies serving reluctant duty. These were men who had endured years of occupation, who had seen their families suffer under English rule, who understood that defeat meant not just death but the end of Scotland as a nation. Bruce had spent months drilling his forces, teaching them tactics that would transform weakness into strength. The weapon of that transformation was the schiltron, a formation that would revolutionize medieval warfare. Traditional military thinking held that infantry existed only to support cavalry or defend against it. Foot soldiers formed defensive squares, bristling with spears to break cavalry charges, then waited for their own knights to win the battle. Bruce envisioned something different, an offensive use of the schiltron that could take the fight to the enemy. He trained his men to advance in tight formations, their long spears creating a moving forest of points that could push back even heavy cavalry. This was not merely tactical innovation, but psychological warfare. Bruce understood that his greatest weapon was not the spear or the axe, but the unshakable belief of his men that they could win. Every drill, every speech, every moment of preparation was designed to build that confidence. When the time came to face the greatest army in Europe, his soldiers would stand firm not because they had no choice, but because they believed in their cause and trusted their king to lead them to victory. As June 1314 dawned, two armies converged on the fields around Stirling Castle like gathering storm clouds. The English host moved with the ponderous weight of empire, their banners snapping in the wind as column after column of steel-clad warriors filled the roads leading north. Edward II rode at their head, desperate to prove himself worthy of his father's crown. Behind him stretched a river of men and horses that seemed to have no end. Bruce watched their approach from the heights near Stirling, his keen eyes taking in every detail of the massive force arrayed against him. He had chosen his ground with the precision of a master chess player, selecting terrain that would neutralize England's crushing advantage in numbers. The battlefield lay between the Bannockburn and the Pelstream Burn, two waterways that created a natural funnel. Here, in this constricted space, the English could not deploy their full strength. Their cavalry would be cramped, their archers hemmed in, their very size turned against them. The Scots took position in the new park, a stretch of woodland and open ground that Bruce had prepared with meticulous care. His engineers had dug pits and scattered caltrops, iron spikes designed to cripple charging horses. Every tree, every slope, every stream had been studied and incorporated into his defensive plan. This was not the random clash of medieval armies, but a carefully orchestrated trap, baited with the prize of Stirling Castle itself. On June 23rd, the first day of battle began with an encounter that would become legend. As the English vanguard probed the Scottish positions, a young knight named Henry de Bohun caught sight of Robert the Bruce riding alone near the front lines. The Scottish king sat lightly armored on a small palfrey, carrying only a battle-axe, seemingly vulnerable and isolated. To Bohun, this was the chance of a lifetime. If he could strike down the rebel king in single combat, the war would end in a single blow. Spurring his massive warhorse to a gallop, Bohun lowered his lance and thundered toward Bruce. The two armies fell silent as they watched their champions race toward each other across the grass. At the last moment, Bruce pulled his horse aside with cat-like grace, rose in his stirrups, and brought his axe down in a mighty swing that split Bohun's helmet and skull in two. The English knight crashed to the earth as Bruce's weapon shattered from the force of the blow. The roar that erupted from the Scottish ranks could be heard for miles. Their king had faced down an armored knight in single combat and emerged victorious. It was an omen, a sign that God himself favored their cause. The English, meanwhile, retreated in confusion and dismay. Their champion lay dead, and the rebel they had come to crush had shown he was no mere fugitive but a warrior king worthy of his crown. That night, as both armies prepared for the greater battle to come, fortune dealt Bruce another unexpected card. Sir Alexander Seton, a Scottish noble serving in Edward's army, slipped away from the English camp under cover of darkness. What he brought to Bruce was intelligence beyond price. The English were demoralized, their confidence shaken by the day's events. Many questioned whether they should even continue the campaign. The great army that had seemed so invincible was riddled with doubt and fear. Bruce seized upon this revelation with the instincts of a born commander. Rather than remain defensive, he would attack. His schiltrons would advance against the English positions, turning the battle into the kind of close-quarters melee where Scottish determination could overcome English numbers. It was a gamble that violated every principle of medieval warfare. But Bruce understood something his enemies did not. Battles are won not by numbers alone, but by the will to fight. Dawn broke on June 24th with an eerie quiet settling over the field. Mist rose from the burns as the two armies formed their lines. The English deployed in traditional fashion, their heavy cavalry in the center, archers on the flanks, infantry in support. They had done this 1,000 times before, and victory had always followed. Edward II, resplendent in his royal armor, took position where he could direct the battle and claim the glory of Scotland's final defeat. Across the field, Bruce's army knelt in prayer. English observers mocked what they saw as a plea for mercy, but the Scots were not begging. They were steeling themselves for the trial ahead, calling upon God to witness their struggle for freedom. When the prayers ended, they rose as one, their schiltrons forming into the tight hedgehogs of spears that would carry them into legend. The battle opened with the crash of English arrows against Scottish shields. Welsh longbowmen, the terror of European battlefields, sent cloud after cloud of shafts arcing through the morning air. But the constrained battlefield worked against them. Packed too close together, unable to find clear lines of fire, their volleys lacked the devastating effect that had broken armies from Wales to France. The Scottish formations absorbed the punishment and kept advancing. Then came the moment that would define the day. Bruce's schiltrons, instead of waiting to receive the English charge, began to move forward, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. The bristling formations of spearmen advanced across the field, like some prehistoric beast awakening from slumber. The English cavalry, expecting to face static defenders, found themselves confronting an enemy that refused to behave according to the rules of war. The collision, when it came, was like thunder splitting the earth. English knights, the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, crashed into the wall of Scottish spears and found themselves trapped. Their horses, bred for the charge, could not break through the forest of points. Riders were pulled from their saddles, trampled underfoot, or skewered by the long weapons of men who fought with the fury of those who had nothing left to lose. What followed was chaos beyond the comprehension of medieval military doctrine. The English heavy cavalry, those masters of mounted warfare who had dominated European battlefields for centuries, found themselves helpless against an enemy that moved like a living fortress. The Scottish schiltrons pressed forward with relentless precision, their spear points finding gaps in armor, their shields locked so tightly that no weapon could penetrate their ranks. Knights who had charged expecting glory found only death in the crush of bodies and steel. The narrow confines of the battlefield became a death trap for Edward's massive army. Where numbers should have been decisive, they became a curse. English soldiers trampled their own comrades as they tried to retreat. The burns that flanked the field, filled with the bodies of drowning men, weighed down by armor that had once seemed like salvation. The very size of the English host worked against them as panic spread through their ranks like wildfire. Sir Robert Keith's light cavalry struck like lightning at the English flanks, scattering the Welsh archers who had been the terror of so many battlefields. Without their protective volleys, The English infantry found themselves exposed to the advancing Scots. Formation after formation crumbled as Bruce's men pushed deeper into the heart of the enemy army. The systematic destruction of Edward's forces was unlike anything witnessed in medieval warfare. At the height of the battle, fortune delivered the final blow to English hopes. From a nearby hill, the Scottish camp followers appeared, waving banners and makeshift weapons. To the exhausted, terrified English soldiers, these servants and grooms looked like fresh reinforcements arriving to seal their doom. What had been a retreat became a rout, as thousands of England's finest warriors fled in absolute terror. King Edward himself barely escaped with his life. The man who had come north to crush a rebellion found himself racing for the border with only a handful of loyal followers. Behind him lay the wreckage of the greatest army England had ever assembled. The roads south became rivers of fleeing men, many of whom would never see home again. Scottish pursuers harried the retreat for days, picking off stragglers and capturing nobles whose ransoms would fund Bruce's kingdom for years to come. The battlefield itself told the story of England's catastrophe. Thousands of bodies carpeted the grass, most wearing the colours of Edward's army. English chroniclers would struggle to explain how their overwhelming advantage had been turned into such complete disaster. The flower of English chivalry lay dead or captured, their proud banners trampled in the mud. Weapons, armour, horses, and the entire English baggage train fell into Scottish hands, providing Bruce with wealth beyond his wildest dreams. Among the dead were names that had struck fear across Europe. 34 English barons and knights would never return home, their deaths leaving gaps in the English nobility that would be felt for generations. The Earl of Gloucester, one of England's most powerful nobles, lay among the fallen. His death symbolized the utter collapse of English power in Scotland. The survivors who managed to reach the border carried with them tales of a battle that defied all military logic. The human cost of Bannockburn extended far beyond the battlefield itself. English losses numbered in the thousands, with estimates ranging from 4,000 to 11,000 dead. Conservative historians suggest at least 3,000 English soldiers perished, while Scottish casualties barely reached 100. The mathematics of medieval warfare had been rewritten in blood. Never before had such a small army inflicted such devastating losses on a force many times its size. For the fleeing English, the nightmare continued long after the battle ended. The roads to the border became a gauntlet of Scottish raiders and hostile locals. Many who survived the battle itself died during the retreat, their bodies left to rot in ditches and forests. Of the mighty host that had marched north with such confidence, perhaps only a third reached safety. The rest joined the growing legend of Bannockburn's terrible toll. The economic impact was equally staggering. The ransom demands for captured English nobles would drain Edward's treasury for years. Lords who had financed the campaign with their own wealth found themselves bankrupted by defeat. The cost of rebuilding England's military capability would consume resources that might have been used for other conquests. In a single battle, Bruce had not only secured Scotland's independence, but crippled England's ability to threaten it again. News of the victory spread across Europe like wildfire, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and wandering soldiers. In the courts of France and the Holy Roman Empire, diplomats began to view Scotland not as a rebellious province, but as a legitimate kingdom worthy of recognition. The balance of power in northern Europe had shifted overnight. Bruce's triumph resonated far beyond the borders of his small kingdom, inspiring other peoples who chafed under foreign rule. The psychological impact of Bannockburn proved even more significant than its immediate military consequences. For centuries, English armies had been considered invincible when properly deployed. The myth of English military supremacy lay shattered on the fields near Stirling. Bruce had demonstrated that courage, cunning, and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The lesson would not be forgotten by future generations of warriors. In Scotland itself, the victory transformed Robert the Bruce from a controversial king into a national hero. Lords who had wavered in their loyalty now flocked to his banner. The common people, who had endured years of occupation and suffering, finally had proof that their sacrifices had meaning. The nation that had seemed on the verge of extinction was reborn in the crucible of battle. Yet Bruce understood that military victory alone would not secure lasting independence. The English would return, probably with an even larger army, and a thirst for revenge. The work of building a truly independent Scotland had only begun. Diplomatic recognition, secure borders, and economic stability all lay ahead. But on that June morning in 1314, as the Scottish king surveyed the field of his greatest triumph, Such concerns could wait. The transformation of medieval warfare tactics began to ripward from pull-out commanders Bannockburn. Military across Europe studied reports of the battle, trying to understand how infantry had defeated the finest cavalry. The rigid hierarchies of medieval armies, where mounted knights reigned supreme, began to crack. The age of the common soldier was dawning, though few recognized it yet. Bruce's tactical innovations would influence military thinking for generations. The offensive use of tightly packed spear formations became a standard technique, copied by armies from Switzerland to the Low Countries. The idea that foot soldiers could not merely defend, but actually attack and defeat, cavalry revolutionized battlefield tactics. Medieval warfare would never be the same. The Scottish schiltrons had proven that discipline and training could overcome individual prowess and expensive equipment. A farmer with a spear, properly trained and motivated, could bring down a knight in full armor. This democratization of warfare would have profound social implications as the warrior aristocracy found their monopoly on military effectiveness challenged by common soldiers. The legend of Bannockburn grew with each retelling, taking on mythical proportions that sometimes obscured the historical reality. Bards sang of the spider that inspired Bruce's persistence, though no contemporary source mentions this famous tale. What mattered was not the literal truth, but the symbolic power of the story. Scotland had faced impossible odds and triumphed through courage and determination. In the years following the battle, Bruce would use his victory as a foundation for diplomatic success. The Declaration of Arbroath in 1320 would cite Bannockburn as proof of Scottish independence, declaring that the Scots would fight for freedom so long as 100 remained alive. The battle became not just a military victory, but a statement of national identity that would echo through the centuries. The English response to defeat was swift but unfocused. Edward's humiliation at Bannockburn contributed to his eventual downfall, as nobles who had lost friends and fortunes in Scotland began to question his fitness to rule. The king, who had sought glory in conquering his northern neighbors, found only shame and political ruin. His reign would end in deposition and death, a victim of the disaster he had helped create. The diplomatic revolution that followed Bannockburn transformed Scotland's position on the European stage. Where once Bruce's emissaries had been dismissed as representatives of a mere rebel, now the courts of France, Norway, and the Papal States received Scottish ambassadors with the respect due to a sovereign nation. The victory had shattered more than English military power. It had broken the diplomatic isolation that had strangled Scotland's hopes for international recognition. Pope John the 2012, who had previously excommunicated Bruce as a usurper, began to reconsider his position as reports of the miraculous victory reached Rome. The Church, always sensitive to divine signs, could hardly ignore a triumph so complete against such overwhelming odds. Letters began to arrive in Avignon, acknowledging Bruce not as a rebel leader but as a legitimate monarch whose cause bore the clear blessing of Providence. The French court, locked in its own struggles with England, saw opportunity in Scotland's resurgence. King Philip IV recognized that Bruce's kingdom could serve as a valuable ally, a northern threat that would force England to divide its attention between two fronts. Treaties of mutual support began to take shape, binding Scotland into the complex web of European alliances that would define the continent's politics for generations. Yet for all the diplomatic gains, Bruce understood that the true test of Bannockburn's legacy lay not in foreign recognition, but in the daily reality of governing an independent kingdom. The years of warfare had left Scotland's infrastructure in ruins. Castles lay in rubble, deliberately destroyed to deny them to English occupiers. Fields had been burned, livestock slaughtered, and entire communities scattered to the winds. Bannockburn stands as perhaps history's greatest example of how courage and tactical brilliance can overcome impossible odds. From those blood-soaked fields near Stirling emerged not just a military victory, but the birth of a nation's enduring spirit. Robert the Bruce had proven that freedom's fire burns brightest when fanned by those who refuse to surrender their dreams. The 800 who stood against 30,000 that June morning didn't just win a battle. They forged a legend that would inspire the oppressed and challenge the mighty for centuries to come, proving that sometimes, just sometimes, David really can fell Goliath.